Mick Jagger, born July 1943. No sooner had the child been named than it was foretold that he would bring great turbulence to the world. Indeed, by the time that he was 2 years old, Europe lay in ruins around the ankles of the prodigious youth, changed forever. Some say it was his dynamic stage presence. Others say it was his excellent singing voice that brought the world to its knees. But one thing is for certain. He knew how to pull a crowd. The warning that I've received, and you may take it with however many grains of salt that you wish, that the brown acid that is circulating around us is not specifically too good. It's suggested that you stay away from that. Of course, it's your own trip, so be my guest, but please be advised that there has been a warning on this one, okay?
You know how they say it's not the end of the world? When that's the first thing people say to you after you come off stage, you know something went seriously wrong. And for me, for a few moments on stage here at Hisense Arena, it felt like time had somehow managed to end. Not stand still, as they say. Actually end. That feeling of time ending, well, for me, the concept of time feels weird all the time. I often feel like I belong in a different time. A time where I could have been around to witness Woodstock or see Martin Luther King or JFK deliver a speech. Or to watch the moon landing while it was really happening. I was only 3 years old when the Berlin Wall came down, so I had to skip the collective fear of the world ending through nuclear holocaust. But I was old enough to be slightly nervous about the millennium bug, so I have that going for me, which is nice. These events that enter the collective consciousness, they always seem to involve crowds or audiences in some way. I guess having a crowd in front of you makes it easier to spread some kind of a message. Unless you're me. So how can you take control of your audience? One of my first experiences of being in a large audience was seeing Bob Geldof here at the Forum. He gave me a high five and I didn't wash my hand for a week afterwards. But back in the mid-80s, the Forum Theatre served as the headquarters for a Christian revivalist group. The revivalists thought it would be a nice venue for the end of the world, which they had scheduled for 1989. By the time it clicked over to 1995, I guess they got sick of waiting and sold their venue of the apocalypse to some concert promoters. So maybe there's a reason cults and rock stars would choose the same kind of venue. Is there something vaguely spiritual that also happens to a crowd at a concert? When we come together, does it even make a difference if it's for a band or some cult figure?
A trip to Switzerland, to Geneva. It was something that I thought I should do. Lots of people thought I shouldn't do. And I made all the inquiries necessary, and I finally ended up having coffee with Albert Speer, who, for those of you who might not be familiar with the name, wrote a book called Behind the Third Reich, and basically was responsible for the Volkswagen, for most of the armament of the German forces, and was a stellar designer. Everything that the Fuhrer would, in fact, appear at or be anywhere around was done by Herr Speer. I brought a roll of plans, and he brought a roll of plans, and his wife translated. And after I showed him the mirror and the things that I was doing for Rolling Stones and what I did, and he had a good laugh at it, right? He then brought out the plans of Nuremberg. It was extreme. You know, it's very rarely that you meet someone who is so qualified, right? And unfortunately, it just happened to be on the other side.
When I found out that Mick Jagger actually hired Hitler's former propaganda filmmaker, Leni Riefenstahl, to photograph he and his wife Bianca, I figured that there must be more of a link between the two personalities than just being able to control their audience. For a long time, I've been fascinated by these people who do have this kind of power. What makes them tick? What's going on in their minds while they're up there? What gives them this commanding power that they have?
Did you ever wonder about the possible sort of brainwashing aspect? The way it was designed as a collective consciousness type thing?
Never really thought a lot about it, except for the fact that that's what design does. When you walk into a theater and the curtain opens, or whatever it does, you are immediately taken away. And that is a brainwashed for all intents and purposes. You are sucked into whatever the element is that you've gone to see. It's like a vacuum. It should be like a vacuum. That's the most important moment, really, is what hooks you.
Now that I'm thinking about it, it's likely that this fascination with performers started around the same time that I became terrified of crowds. Back at school, when I started taking piano lessons. Like all the other children, I had to perform a short piece at a school concert, so I chose a very basic version of Scott Joplin's The Entertainer. glare of the lights, I can only make out one face. A middle-aged man with a beard who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else. For a moment, my eyes lock with his, and I feel like he's boring a hole into my consciousness, reading my thoughts, not liking them. He actually looks angry now. Whatever dark secrets he retrieved from my psyche, he certainly doesn't think I'm deserving of 2.5 minutes of stage time. My eyes returned to my fingers at the keyboard. I hadn't realized I'd stopped playing. And after several attempts to pick up where I left off, I decided to start again and finally blunder my way through. I guess there's a reason I later became a guitar teacher.
Fred, whether he likes it or not, is committed to make a speech. Fred's trapped. He feels as if he just agreed to make a parachute jump or ride a rocket to the moon. And this is just the beginning. For Fred is on his way to all the terror, all the worry, all the pain of an ailment commonly known as stage fright.
So I started dealing with audiences in a less direct way, through a camera lens. But ever since those first nerve-wracking moments on stage, I've always been fascinated by these people who do have the power to control their audience. And every time I do find myself in front of a crowd, without fail I can look out and see an angry, bearded man glaring back at me.
Hey, that was neat, but don't be so self-conscious about it. Self-conscious. That was my trouble. That was why I felt so queer. And I begin to remember other times I'd had the same feeling.
Fear. And what are you afraid of? Are you afraid someone in your audience will stand up and take a pot shot at you? That you will fall off the platform?
I felt uncomfortable and awkward and different. And they were all watching me.
What was it about him that drew you into that situation?
I just was interested to see, how did that happen? And not from my youth to rush off to the Forum or to Madison Square Garden and duplicate it, But strangely enough, Van Halen picked it up. Lots of acts have picked it up. The vertical banner and all that is very popular. Mm. Yeah. And summons you back to a certain point in history, I suppose.
And where do you think this is? Hiding behind the American flag, right in Madison Square Garden, USA.
It was a bit of a shock to find footage of a 1930s Nazi rally taking place in one of America's most famous venues. Madison Square Garden is almost holy ground for me because it was the site of John Lennon's final concert appearance. But again, it's just another venue being used for mass gatherings of vastly different circumstance.
Do you ever feel that there's a sense of power when you walk out and there are thousands of people cheering for you?
Not in the sense of the National Socialist Party sort of, Hitler rally or something like that. It's not a sense of going out and working people up into a frenzy. I mean, I know there are bands that do that. The raised fist, the heavy metal, the sort of hard rock kind of thing. But that, we're not like that. It's a bit more invitational. It's, come and find us, meet people halfway. But if you go out there and try and get all over them with this sort of rabble-rousing behaviour, I think it's rather vulgar. If I think there's a bit of that going on, I want to be somewhere else. I step outside of it.
Ian's warning only enticed me further. I needed to speak with some other performers to try to understand how they approach their relationships with audiences. I was hoping to learn something about the power of the situation, and hopefully to come away with a few tricks up my sleeve. It was time to head for the entertainment capital of the world. I can't always get to sleep on a plane, but when I do, I find myself having strange dreams. Sometimes I'm on stage in these dreams, and it's great until the bearded men arrive. Suddenly, the whole crowd is made up of bearded men, and I'm terrified. They never speak, they just sit there, glaring disapprovingly. Recently though, in real life, one of the bearded men actually did say something. It was at a Q&A session at a film festival in Beijing. When he was handed the microphone, he uncrossed his arms and asked me where I got the audacity to put myself in my films. I can't even remember how I responded. I was so frozen with fear. And the whole incident was becoming more and more dreamlike because I was jet-lagged and everything that was said was being translated into Mandarin. But I'm sure the truth is, it's a similar reason to why a person would put themselves in front of a crowd.
Ladies and gentlemen, at this time we are on our final approach into Los Angeles, the home of the 1984 Summer Olympics.
Los Angeles is a city of dreams and dream makers. In the minds of millions of people worldwide, the image of America and Americans was created right here in Hollywood.
Have you ever felt a sense of power over an audience?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. The stand-up audience relationship is very much a power play, very much. In fact, one of the reasons why comedians are worth listening to when they criticize conventional mores or the status quo is because we know a lot about groupthink. That's our stock in trade. We take X hundred number of individuals and we get them all thinking exactly the same way to such a degree that at some point they all in unison have an involuntary physical response. It's crazy power.
Could you tell us a bit more about groupthink? What's your understanding of that?
Well, it's very easy to manipulate an audience. And I don't necessarily mean that with its negative connotations. It's just, you just get a sense as a comedian that you can turn 200, 300, 500, 1,000, 10,000 individuals into one entity. They go from being animals to being cells in one big giant animal. We are very, very well versed in that. We're all aware of that.
There's always going to be some of that sort of thing, that strange crowd empathy that occurs, whether it's at a football match or a rock concert or in hallowed halls of some great cathedral at a Christmas carol service. I mean, those things happen, and I like to think that in a positive way you can just dance around the fringes of that phenomenon, if indeed it exists. But you've got to be a little careful about getting too deeply into those more spiritual aspects of what entertainment, what worship, what being at a political rally is all about.
The mechanics of groupthink, the instincts for groupthink, the temptations of groupthink are really, really powerful.
Regarded as an infection, it's not necessarily a bad one. It isn't going to ruin your life or bring an untimely end. But you've got to be a little careful about getting caught up in that stuff. Collective consciousness is only just a little step away from falling under the spell of the Reverend Jones or an Adolf Hitler.
There's a lot of manipulation. There's a lot of tricks of the trade, you know. We just know how to get a whole group to all shift. It's like fish schooling, really. It's like, you know, when one fish turns, they all just go right there. We see that happen with audiences all the time. It's unbelievable.
Yes, in these lands, the people surrendered their liberties and threw away their human dignity. They gave up their rights as individual human beings. They became a part of a mass, a human herd.
That's groupthink, that's manipulation. And you can use that power for good or evil.
I think I have some small idea of what this whole groupthink thing is about. I once found myself in a mosh pit when the whole crowd suddenly started doing this strange push-pull motion with their arms. I looked around, embarrassed for the people who were caught up in this weird movement, but when I looked back to the front, I realized that I'd started doing it too. I was beginning to feel like the musicians on stage had an agenda. Maybe they wanted the crowd to launch an invasion of Poland.
We're all guilty of, or at least guilty of wanting to misuse power when we think it's in our hands. It's a very easy thing to start using it and you know, seeking some gratification or some tangible end result by using that power. Parents will do it with their children. You know, teachers will do it with their pupils, and vice versa. Pupils, once they realize they can get the upper hand with their teachers, will do it to their teachers too. I mean, it gets dangerous when it's politicians and dictators.
They say trouble always comes in threes. Take a good close look at this trio. Remember these faces. Remember them well. If you ever meet them, don't hesitate.
I was starting to wonder whether the feeling of being on stage is somehow similar to the feeling of standing in front of a classroom. But when I'm teaching a class, at least there aren't any bearded faces staring back at me.
And then I remembered the first time I asked June for a date. I knew just what I wanted to say, but when it came right down to it, yeah, I felt spotlighted again. And the words didn't want to come out. And she was staring at...
One of the worst audiences I've ever experienced. Well, I take full responsibility for them being among the worst audiences I've ever known. It was the day the Pope died, and I happened to be playing a club in Atlanta, Georgia. So I said, well, how often does a Pope die? I gotta go up and do it. So I opened with some material about the Pope and the Catholic Church, and it was a packed audience of about 500. By 10 minutes in, 250 of them had left in anger. But God, it was fun. God, it was fun. It's really interesting in dealing with audiences that don't want to be confronted, or a subject matter that people don't want to go to. That's always the most interesting territory for me, because it means that people haven't really picked it up and looked at it at all sides, whatever that issue is.
30 years after the Nazis burnt their books, the world seemed torn between a culture of militarism and a culture of permissiveness. This clash of ideologies reached its apex on a farm in upstate New York. It happened 3.5 weeks after the moon landing, where 456,000 people came together for 3.5 days of peace and music. When you've got an audience the size of 25 Madison Square Gardens squished into a couple of paddocks in front of you, what can one man with a guitar possibly do?
Give me an F! Give me a U! Give me a C! Give me a K! What's that spell? 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 All right. I just yelled, give me an F. And they all responded and looked at me.
And then one thing led to another. I couldn't stop, and they all started singing along and clapping and standing up and stuff. And then that's just the way it happened.
Well, come on, all of you big strong men. Uncle Sam needs help again. Got himself in a terrible jam way down yonder in Vietnam. Put down your books, pick up a gun. We're gonna have a whole lot of fun. And it's 1, 2, 3. What are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next up is Vietnam, and it's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all gonna die. Come on, Wall Street.
As someone who has had command in a certain way of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people, do you have any thoughts on the relationship between the negative and positive?
Well, you're putting a label on it of negative and positive, but I don't think that the Nazis and there have been many situations like that where a particular group, an interest group, has a particular rally, and the focus of the rally is us and them. But I think that the dynamic is the same, as Woodstock. Somebody's doing something on stage, the people in the audience are digging it. They're digging it, and the theme is different. At Woodstock it was, can't we all get along, peace and love? At Nuremberg it was, kill those other people and we'll take over and we'll kill those other people. But that's just the nature of human beings, I think. I think it was unique to have a gentle, kind of loving, cooperative. I don't know. I wonder if there was a cooperative spirit amongst the Nazis. When somebody did get hurt, and they say, "Can I help you out, brother? You seem to have hurt your leg." Were they kind to each other? I don't know. Perhaps.
Speaking with Joe McDonald here in San Francisco, I was finding my assumptions challenged. And the way I was thinking about audiences was starting to change dramatically. I had probably been drawing comparisons between musical and political audiences, because both situations tend to center around a leader. But in the search to understand the power and the approach of these leaders, I may have inadvertently stumbled upon something far more important. A crowd that doesn't have a leader, like a protest, might just be the antidote to all this leader worship and groupthink manipulation. And as one of the largest anti-war protests of the 1960s, Woodstock is an example of a situation where the power was very much in the hands of its audience.
You got a sense that there was something quasi-sacred about the whole thing. A bunch of us were sitting around a little bit of a fire in a teepee and passing a joint, and a lot of silence went on, and there was a hubbub outside. And I said, "What's up?" And they all seemed to communicate like Indians, honest to God. The hippies who had been in collectives. In the headlights of the bus further, they threw the I Ching to see how this was all going to work out. At the end of it, I said, "How's it going to turn out?" And they said, "It's going to be great."
We had to remember at the time that as many people were at Woodstock were equal to the many people who were slogging through the jungles of Vietnam. There were 500,000 young men who were fighting a war that we did not believe in, and we did not want to display, that kind of vengeance, even though all of us were standing opposed to the kind of political authority that was in front of us.
The first thing we had to do on the first day was to fight with the chief of staff of Nelson Rockefeller, who was the governor, who wanted to shut the whole thing down. Send in the National Guard, shut everything down. Do what he in fact did at Attica, the prison, where 27, 28 people died. And so I spent my first waking hours arguing with them about how stupid it would be to try to move them out. So they sent us National Guard medical units. We had 3 of them who set up tents and took care of a whole bunch of things. So something that could have been a disaster turned out to be much better.
We had preparation for it, though. There had been be-ins in Central Park that Allen Ginsberg and other people had formed, and 100,000 people would come together, and it was just lovely. You know, you'd be on Sheep's Meadow, and people would just be grooving, and music playing. There was a lot of emotion attached to these gatherings. They weren't frivolous, they weren't just fun, you know. I mean, we were there for a purpose, and I really felt like at Woodstock that purpose really coalesced.
As an announcer, was there a sense of responsibility toward the crowd? Did you feel like some kind of a shepherd?
Oh, Christ, yes. I mean, you stand up there and look at a sea of faces. You got a microphone, you realize that you're the only one talking to all of these people. And things go through your head about whether things can be turned or twisted. They can be twisted and turned in very positive ways. We just said to everybody after Baez had played, which was a very peaceful thing. It was like, okay, good night. Say goodnight to each other, we'll see you in the morning. And there was that kind of thing. Be kind to your neighbor, you know. And that is easily done.
There's been a warning that you stay away from this, but it's your trip, so be my guest. But please be advised that there's a warning on that. And then I went right into another announcement because there wasn't anything else to do. I mean, how many people had taken the brown acid? You know, it was one of the most difficult announcements I've ever made. Because, you know, how many people were in danger or how many people are now in danger? You know?
So the audience could have gone either way with that. That they could have panicked or...
Sure. Luckily enough, there obviously wasn't enough around. Or who knows whether it was good or bad. You know, I always make a joke about it that I was selling the blue and I had to make the announcement.
The 60s was a peculiar historical moment. The traditions and the cultural expectations of that World War II generation were wearing thin, and they were boring, pretty much boring to us. And we began doing our own thing. We began to have our own audience. We had a lot in common. And one thing in particular that we had in common was not feeling safe in the status quo. We felt they were out to get us, to draft us into war or to arrest us for smoking marijuana or one thing or another. You know, they didn't understand us.
But when those National Guard helicopters flew over the crowd, they came over from behind. You can hear the whoop, 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 whoop,
Right.
whoop, and so can the audience. And I was the one that could see him. And I went, ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. Army. Whoa, it's Medical Corps. And it changed just like that in a second.
Yeah. A whole group of people managed miraculously, I mean really miraculously, to come together at a place, at a time, to celebrate and wrestle peace from the music. And our film, in its own way, is an anthropological essay, representation of how that can happen. I think it demonstrated to the world that people could congregate, could become a unit, could communicate, could respect each other.
I remember thinking, my God, I had no idea that there were so many people in agreement. And that was the big word.
That's yeah.
Agreement, you know, and that's really what civilization is agreeing that we're all going to drive on the right side of the road or whatever, you know, that we agree just what our rules are, what our social rules are.
In old European countries and such, I mean, you'll be playing the music that your great-great-grandfather enjoyed and your grandfather enjoyed and your grandmother, and everybody's doing the traditional dances that were done for hundreds of years, you know. But starting in the rock and roll, rhythm and blues eras, it began to change, and it changed pretty quickly. We're at the same kind of particular moment in history right now with those same nations, I think, and other nations, that the morality of the new generation is so in clash with the old generation.
The establishment was nervous then because of the war, and the war was so unpopular. The establishment now is nervous because of everything. It's still a tension. You know, what's a gathering? How dangerous or how fruitful is a gathering to the people who think they're in charge of something. And this next generation's making, whenever they get together, they have to mace them or something.
You have to stand behind a fence at a college campus if you want to be on a soapbox and talk politically about something. You have to be in a free speech zone, or you're going to be arrested.
The rock festival culture that Woodstock created spreads the power of the stage across many different performers. And maybe that's where a crowd can be at its most beautiful, when they come together without the involvement of one specific leader. The leaderless nature of a protest must be disconcerting for establishment figures who do use their persona as a tool to gain control. So it makes sense that one of the first moves of a frightened government is to clamp down on a crowd's ability to protest and spread their message. And if strict congregation laws don't hold the people back, the next logical step is to put up a wall. Several American cities have pieces of the Berlin Wall on display. Maybe because JFK delivered one of his most famous speeches there. There's a common misconception that he used some bad German grammar with an interesting double meaning, so the crowd apparently heard the president say,
"As a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner."
But I have it on good authority that the Berliners in the audience all knew what he meant. He was there to console an enormous crowd of West Berliners not long after the wall went up.
It was just a year ago that authorities in communist Germany, appalled at the numbers who were fleeing to the west, threw up the wall. East German boss Ulbricht cut worshippers from their churches, separated parents from their children. On this anniversary, wreaths are placed where people died jumping to freedom. At dusk, tensions erupt in a rock-throwing barrage. The police have their hands full and don't succeed in quieting the Westerners for some time.
Strangely enough, the wall always reminds me of the Rolling Stones. I know it's not their album, but it always fascinated me that the Stones were the first Western band to be invited to play a concert behind the Iron Curtain.
The border is strengthened, but still they escape. She hangs from a second-story window. The Red Police try to pull her back. The Westerners try to free their grip.
Walls and fences are often used to control crowds. Totalitarian political figures seem to use them as a kind of dam for people.
Barbed wire and cement were the answers to the refugee problem.
East Germans grasp any fleeting chance. A guard's back is turned, the barbed wire is slashed, and Westerners stretch forth willing hands to pull them to asylum. They gamble that a sudden rifle shot won't end their dreams, that a slip won't bring disaster.
Despotic governments also seem to love placing heavy restrictions on the freedom of the press and broadcasters, and creating or publishing satire often becomes one of the first offences that will get you locked away. But here in the future, it's a lot harder to control what audiences have access to.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Vice President.
All the people who sent us here have different backgrounds, different stories, different beliefs. We do not give up. Not today. We do not get stuck and we're playing. All the people who sent us here have different backgrounds, different stories, different beliefs. We do not give up. Not today. We do not get stuck and we're playing. No matter who we are or where we come from, each of us is a part. There's something greater, more consequential than we individually are.
This all seems harmless enough to me. So what is it that makes an establishment so nervous about satire? Is it possible that this is another powerful way to diffuse groupthink?
So was that something that has a real draw for you is to sort of subvert someone's original intention?
It's not always a subversion of intent. Sometimes, and I would say most often for us, it's even an amplification, where by adding music to someone's words, we can actually distill the original message and put it on a higher platform than it might even be as a spoken word.
I think you're right. It's like, if they're making a point, why not make that point in an even more powerful way by singing it in the key of C?
Yeah, we the promised land, a sacred place, getting blessed by Joe Biden from space.
God bless America. God bless America. God bless, God bless, God bless America.
When I was interviewing people for Satiristas, people who work in subversive or transgressive countercultural comedy, I would say, do you think it makes a difference? Do you think satire or comedy can make any sort of a difference? And so many people said, well, you know the famous quote by Peter Cook, who said, satire, oh yeah, remember how the Weimar Cabaret stopped Hitler? You know, so does it really have any effect, whatever? Yeah, it does. It's been going on forever. You know, it's just kind of keeping the flame alive.
Do you think there's much difference between the political involvement of the current generation as opposed to previous generations?
I don't know if our generation is less politically involved, because I haven't been alive for very long. Mm-hmm. But I mean, when you look at footage from the 60s and everybody just kind of rising up and just kind of changing things, we definitely don't have that.
The challenge is I think this is the same as it was in an A generation, which is just like, is there a desire to know? And I think there have been times in our country's history where the desire to have that information and to analyze it and to compare it with all sorts of other sources of information has been much greater, because the need is greater to know those things and to be involved politically.
Paul Krasner and Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were the original Yippies. And the Yippies were basically agitprop satire. You know, they were very politicized, but their methodology was satire. You know, moments like they threw dollar bills out onto the floor of the stock exchange, creating massive havoc. You know, they're the ones who organized everybody gathering around the Pentagon, holding hands and trying to levitate the Pentagon.
We will march directly to the Pentagon, and those who wish to proceed to protest closer and perhaps more militantly to the Pentagon may do so.
They ran a pig for president in '68 on an independent ticket. They were very, very comedically subversive. And Abby Hoffman himself actually really invented the soundbite. He very consciously said, look, there's 7.5 or 8 minutes of film in every news camera, and they're only going to lead off a story if you give them a nice 10-second thing that's going to hook everybody in. So let's do that as much as we can. And he did it by creating really funny ideas and moments.
Take the case of Newt Gingrich criticizing portable electric spa funding.
Line 5, portable electric spa. Portable electric spa. I don't know what a portable electric spa is. I was told it was a jacuzzi.
That might just kind of flit by in the public consciousness. We tried to capture it in song, and then upon repeat viewings, new subtleties arise from this music, and you're able to really analyze this issue with a new level-headed take. Similarly, if you were at the club and there was a young woman there that you might want to make love to, you might be flustered by this issue. You might be kind of torn emotionally and not sure how to approach it. But then if Usher's I Want to Make Love in This Club were to come on, it would allow you to kind of attack this issue in a new way. It would give you perspective on how you could approach this young woman and really have a meeting of the minds on how you could kind of get over this obstacle.
When you say get acquainted, you really mean it, don't you?
So stand-up comedy actually works with all the hallmarks of Gene Sharp, who wrote From Dictatorship to Democracy, and is kind of a handbook for nonviolent revolution. He says you don't bring down a government. A government is this big, huge slab on top of everything. And it's held up by pillars. And you don't go after the huge slab. you take away the pillars. And one of the ways he says you do that is the police, the military, when you're in a confrontational situation with literally the enforcer of the institution, when you're literally face to face, you know, the cops, the military, they're us. They're the 99%. They're not running things. They are closer to us than anything else. So instead of putting your most fierce warriors out in front there, you put the old ladies and the little kids out in front so that they relate, so that they see the humanity that this is all about. And their positions as authority figures and as enforcers have to now go through their moral filter. So you're putting them in a position to make the correct moral choice. Stand-up comedy does that. Stand-up comedy is the mother and the child who are out in front going, "Hi, come on in. We're going to have a nice time here today. We hope we're all going to have fun."
In spring, a young man's fancy tells him it's just delightful to be in a be-in. And that's what this is. Another exotic prank to add to a growing list of student-oriented rites of spring. It's sort of a happy happening for hippies. You're out if you're not in a be-in, the recurring theme of which is love one another. Seattle's be-in is the latest chapter of fresh air frolics, perfect for group therapy.
I've always felt a strong connection with the spirit of the 60s because to me that time represents a real feeling of sincerity and hopefulness. When the crowd effectively took control of Woodstock, it was all about peace and love. But a few months later, the crowd took control of another concert which was headlined by the Rolling Stones. The Altamont Speedway Free Festival was to become one of the most infamous concerts of all time, when an audience member was stabbed and died in front of the stage, while Mick Jagger pleaded for calm.
Have you ever witnessed a situation where an audience has turned ugly?
Well, I was at Altamont, and that had the strongest negativity of any group environment that I've ever experienced. From the moment we got there, it was palpable. I mean, literally, it felt like evil in the air. It felt like this weight that was, there wasn't the lightness of all the hippie movement prior to that, living in San Francisco in the Bay Area and never really considering myself a hippie, but being around that and knowing what that feeling could be, this was the exact opposite. It was like animalistic at Altamont.
That was so shocking. And, you know, you realize, oh my gosh, you know, I mean, it doesn't always turn out beautifully.
There was something permeating the air there that that certainly caused that emotion to be there, and certainly that negativity did come to light.
It embarrassed the living daylights out of Jagger because they did sing Street Fighting Man. They did have, you know, a lot of songs in that direction and that level.
You know, obviously there was miscommunication and it was the wrong idea to use Hells Angels for security. Even though what they did, in their mind, they saw someone with a gun. They thought a performer was going to be assassinated or something like that.
Most of the Angels superiors were at a meeting somewhere else, so the juniors, as it were in charge. And since the payment for their security was a bushel basket of assorted pills and a U-Haul truck full of beer, they didn't really have any balance, you know, to help anybody out.
Teenage sickle hounds going all out for thrills, laughing at danger, playing at love, the kind of playing that leads to plenty trouble.
I mean, Mick got smacked in the mouth the minute he stepped out of his trailer to go on. One of the Angels hit him. They also beat up Marty Ballin from the airplane.
I just wanted to get out of there. We chose even to not be in the film because it was so weighty and negative, even though we performed there and were filmed there like the other groups.
you had to speak to the family of the person who was killed.
I thought something should be said. And I said it, that, it is an absolute disaster has happened to your life and we caused it. And I'm not a Hell's Angel, I'm a technician, I'm a designer. I work for one of the acts. And I'm terribly sorry.
Why did you feel that was your responsibility?
It wasn't my responsibility. It should have been done by fucking Jagger. Or anybody else that had any clout.
Mick didn't want to come back for a while. And there were reasons why they didn't come back for a while. I mean, there were threats from the Angels to Jagger. He was very paranoid about going on stage. And we had conversations like, look, Mick, if somebody's going to get you, they're going to get you. I can hire the best security, we can sweep the halls, we can do this, that, and the other. But if somebody wants you, they're going to get you because you've got 50, 60,000 people out there and you just can't control all of them. I remember saying to him, we can get you an Eichmann-style booth that you can perform in. And he started laughing, but that was the first break of the fear.
The trial of Adolf Eichmann begins.
So that's one place. I mean, there's other things. I've been, done a concert in Italy years ago with Santana where people were throwing bricks and stones, and this is apparently when they love you.
There was a lot of hostility at the Isle of Wight in 1970, but again, it wasn't really within the orbit of those that you were entertaining. It was on the periphery. It was outside where some more anarchic, extremist kind of stuff was going on. It was the dying embers of that hippie era and a change from easygoing love and peace kind of values to something, we don't get what we want, we're going to take it.
So much was going on culturally in terms of the war, the Vietnam War, and politics, and things were changing. People were experiencing things they hadn't felt, and the drugs had something to do with it. People were feeling liberated and that they could break away and make a new way in society. And that was the thing then. Stick it to the man.
Who was the man?
It was the authority. It was it was your parents. It was the police. It was your teachers. It was your politicians. It was, all those people that trying to tell you to live a life that you didn't want to live or didn't believe in. And you watched what they were doing with theirs and they were doing with ours. And the biggest thing was that people were being sent to war that they really didn't believe in. And they really thought was an evil war that was manufactured by Nixon and people like that. They knew it was wrong. And they saw when they started to speak out about it, that the way that police and government reacted in such a violent way back. And that drew some lines.
This is Captain Frank Chapman. We will be landing in Washington in 5 minutes.
Funny, I've seen this place hundreds of times in pictures. But this is the real thing. And what a kick you get out of seeing it for the first time.
Even after getting in touch with various minders of every member of the US Congress, not one of them wanted to talk on camera about the feeling of power they all probably share with Mick Jagger. I was starting to get sick of the political doublespeak, so I went to the one place where I knew I could find some sincerity. And I was about to be given some idea of why music can provoke an audience reaction on par with the most extreme political machine.
Do you feel a sense of power when you step out onto a stage?
I don't know if power is the right word for it. I mean, it's an experience of drawing them into the emotion that I'm going through. And the more that happens, the more I feel like I become sort of just a part of like a bigger picture rather than just me on stage playing a song for somebody. You know, I feel like I want to draw the audience in and have them be just as much a part of it as the bass player is, in a sense, you know, or the drummer or other musicians on stage. There's a feeling of satisfaction that comes out of that. You know, a feeling of being really in the moment and really experiencing every second.
The notes and the tones, whether it's an orchestra, whether it's a band, whether it's a song, it creates an architecture and some kind of emotional space for us to be in.
There's such a shared culture of music, like, you know, everybody knows Mary Had a Little Lamb, or
I Kissed a Girl by Katy Perry.
I Kissed a Girl by Katy Perry, whether they want to have that in their brain or not.
For example.
But music definitely does have that unifying power, and it affects you on this like kind of very core level. It can change your emotions and unify the emotions of all the people that are kind of having that experience at the same time and guide the way you're feeling. I think, and most music is intended to bring people together, whether it is to bring them emotionally together or to bring their bodies together.
Boom, chick, boom, boom, chick, boom, chick, boom.
Yeah. And when you have that kind of connection with the audience, when you really feel like the room is listening and you're listening to them, it's extraordinary. It's, you know, nothing really feels better. It's a really great feeling.
You can have a magic moment of movement on stage, and all of a sudden, if you pull the right cue and everything changes, it's with the precise color, and all of the focus is reduced to this single entity. That's one of the nicest feelings there is. Sillily enough, it can be as simple as Midnight Rambler when Jagger drops to his knees, takes his belt off, and slaps the stage, and every fucking thing goes red. And only him is seen. And the belt hits the deck, right? And you can hear this. Then you know, got him.
Word on the street was Mick Jagger had been spotted at the White House. It was widely publicized as a concert for the president, but given Jagger's questionable history, I couldn't help but wonder about his real motives for visiting Washington. There were rumors of a coup involving Jeff Beck and Buddy Guy, but this allegedly fell through in the face of Jagger's increasing paranoia.
You put poison in my coffee.
Of course, to uncover the truth in any given situation, all you have to do is play the record backwards.
Do you think that Albert Speer would have had similar moments with Hitler that you had with Jagger?
If he was allowed to. See, it's an entirely different, you know, All I ended up doing was being a thorn in his side and kept pushing him, and it was a rebel, and he wished to get the fuck out of the theater, you know, right? Don't you think it's time that we tried to make a little effort, right? How long do you want to be a garage band? I could get one of those sentences out maybe once a month. You know. And I'm sure that Herr Speer would not have spoken to the Führer in that fashion.
We keep talking about Hitler. Why am I? It's the third time I've talked about Hitler today.
He's one of the main
I'm
subjects.
talked about Hitler for about 10 years, but he's just come up again today 3 times in my life. So, yeah, I mean, you know, we have to think, what was he born a bad and ugly child or something? You know, to me, it's always fascinating to know what's the pivotal moment that sends some people this way and other people that way. It's the what-if moments. You know, supposing the young Adolf Hitler had decided to become a priest instead of joining the army and finally, you know, getting involved in the dangerous side of politics. He might have been a wonderful character. Could have used his power of oratory in a positive way within an organized and benevolent church, or he might have turned into the equivalent of some god-awful gospel TV evangelist preacher, you know, rallying people, you know, in some iniquitous way to get their money to fund his Rolls Royce and his 10-bedroom home.
Does a performer like Mick Jagger acknowledge the sense of power of being the focal point for that many people?
Oh, sure. Lives for it. Look, there isn't a performer in the world, for all intents and purposes, that doesn't have the same illness. It's requirement of approval. It's the absolute necessity to be accepted and applauded and loved by their audience in its entirety. And that's why they do it. They're good at it because they need it.
Most of us not really interested in going out there and trying to change people, trying to use that power. Most of us don't need to do that. You know, we're a bit more secure in ourselves, but it's often a sign of deep insecurity, isn't it? The people who have to do that in order to demonstrate this power. They need it for themselves because they're essentially insecure people.
I think I've been caught out on some level. If I was feeling completely secure in myself, I probably wouldn't be obsessing over the power of being on stage. Maybe I'd be focusing more on the power of the audience itself, a more spiritual angle. But finally, here is New York City, the home of Madison Square Garden and countless other holy sites. Suddenly I've forgotten about my insecurities. This feels like the road to a big performance somewhere in the future. But I still have some questions about the relationship between political and musical audiences. And I'm still wondering about those spiritual overtones.
I had never heard Ravi Shankar, and so I didn't know what it was going to be. But about halfway through the raga, the whole audience was just wrapped in it. And I thought, this is not going the way I thought it would go. It's like watching some kind of conversion. It's like watching a minister convert somebody who believed in the devil. It takes place right before your eyes, but also it takes place with the audience too, because the audience was so into it that they were responding to every note. It was so interesting to watch how that music taught everybody something they hadn't expected to find.
You guys have worked with quite a few politicians over the years. Is there anybody in particular who stands out as having a strong command over their audience?
One of the people that we did do a film about who ended up being a politician, although he wasn't exactly a politician when we began filming him, was Al Franken, who was subsequently become a senator, but he was at a point where he was kind of changing over from his Saturday Night Live persona into writing books and really wanting to change things and kind of talk about the way the politics was going.
But I fear the detention provisions in this bill forget the lessons we learned from the mistakes we made when we destroyed the lives of supposed communist sympathizers with nary a shred of evidence of guilt.
The audiences for Al were really interesting because they were looking for somebody to kind of give them answers, and it was kind of at a point in this country where a lot of different comedic and television figures like Jon Stewart were starting to be looked at for political news.
In 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik. This scared the heck out of America. So my parents marched my brother and me into our living room and said to us, "You boys are going to study math and science so we can beat the Soviets." I thought that was a lot of pressure to put on a 6-year-old.
The power of being able to tell jokes while you're telling a serious message is an amazing skill. It was interesting to watch audiences for that reason, because they loved coming to hear him, because they knew they were going to get something besides some kind of political knowledge. They were going to get entertained.
And he could talk off script. I mean, he didn't need a script at all. And that's amazing. Kennedy could do that, and Obama can do that, and Clinton could do that.
For too long, politicians have told the most of us that are doing all right that what's really wrong with America is the rest of us. Them. There is no them. There is only us.
Clinton, had a huge amount of charisma, and I think was one of his strongest points, and still is. People hear him speak, and they really come away with a lot of admiration for him. Not all politicians can kind of give that effect.
In halls such as this, where another former president stood and fought this issue out of Social Security against the same charges. But I refuse to see us live on the accomplishments of another generation. I refuse to see this country and all of us shrink from these struggles, which are our responsibility in our time, because what we are now talking about in our children's day will seem to be the ordinary business of government.
Did you meet Kennedy?
Oh yeah, many times. Occasionally I filmed him doing things that he knew I wasn't going to release. The morning that his mother-in-law called him up and was bawling him out because the cook had just quit. And it was a big story in the Times. And he was saying, "Yes, Mrs. Auchincloss, no." And I was filming him, and he was kind of laughing at my filming him. It didn't bother him. Jack would show me the holes in the floor in the Oval Office, and he said, "You know what they are?" And I said, "No." And he said, "That's where Eisenhower had his golf shoes." And it left little holes all in this corkish floor.
The Twilight Zone will not be seen tonight, so that we may bring you the fourth discussion between Vice President Richard Nixon and Senator John Kennedy. The Twilight Zone will return next week on most of these stations.
For me, a debate between JFK and Richard Nixon probably qualifies as being its own episode of The Twilight Zone. I always thought it was strange that Nixon actually did take the presidency 8 years later. He won the Republican nomination over Mitt Romney's dad and took over the Vietnam War from Lyndon Johnson. It was under Johnson and Nixon that the protest era really began, drawing crowds larger than authorities had had to deal with in the past. And as history repeats itself, we've been coming together to protest ever since.
I've been on so many marches over the course of my life, and some of them were so beautiful and so huge and seemed, how can this be ignored? And of course, because it's a march and a rally, it lasts for at most 2 days, in 2 days, it's gone. And 2 days after that, the media can stop talking about it. The actual occupying aspect of the Occupy movement, it's just pretty amazing in how well it's been able to maintain itself and how well it's forced the issue to stay in the media and thus the public eye.
Just a little spark of something, in this case, some people going to Wall Street and setting up an encampment, just boom, caught on. I mean, it's one thing to advertise something and try to cram it down people's throats, but obviously it was time for something to happen.
Just via one tweet on Twitter, where I said, hey, check out our tour dates. If you're occupying in your town, let me know and I'll come by. And I was able to hook up with people around, different towns around the South doing that, and either stop by and, play a song or just invite people down to the show to talk or leaflet or whatever.
You can't dream these things up. People just sort of create them collectively. It's a funny human thing that happens, which I'm not a really religious person, but I mean, there is a spiritual something that happens. It's amazing. And in the 60s, I was always surprised that something would happen in America and then boom, within 24 hours in France and Germany, I mean, it was happening. So there are these moments, it almost seems like science fiction in a way.
1968. Unrest begins in urban centers of culture. Berkeley, New York, Tokyo, Rome, Prague. France, the mother country of revolution, seems immune. But as in 1848, a new source of discontent appears outside the old social structure. Angry students spontaneously take to the streets and occupy the Sorbonne for the first time in its history. Radio coverage of the night's events unintentionally coordinates student action. This is the first indication of the new role to be played by the mass media in the month-long drama.
Getting back to the stage, how would you characterize your relationship with your audience?
I think that we have a particularly interesting dynamic with our audience where the lack of fourth wall between performer and audience that we grew up with in the punk and hardcore world has kind of carried over even to some of the bigger shows that we've played. And the crowd spills over onto the stage, which happens 90% of the time at hardcore and punk shows, I enjoy a show that at least has a few holes punched through it.
The one for me was Depeche Mode filming David. They reached down to a girl and she passed out. That kind of power between a performer and the audience must be very strange to have something like that happen.
But he did this thing of waving his arms back and forth. And when you see this whole audience of as far as the eye can see, and they're all going just like this in time to the music, it's just, it really shakes you. It's a heavy thing to watch.
As soon as you got rid of this notion of they're not going to come surging over the top of the fence except one by one, and you can kind of handle that if that occurs, and there are a couple of shots of naked guys climbing over the fence. I mean, we see Bear Rubs doing that. There was nothing that was really alarming.
I'm very conscious of the physical dynamic in our audience, and I don't ever want to see anybody getting hurt. I am a fan of slam dancing and stage diving within reason, but I have seen it, get ugly, or I've seen people who are just running around banging into people with the intent to do damage, So I've jumped into the crowd to stop fights and, stop songs and to call somebody out. And if it's not that dire situation, I usually try and address it with humor. But there's certainly been times when I've had to be like, fucking cut it out, You're hurting people, get the fuck out of here kind of thing, So it does happen.
Roxy Music had a terrible time in Madison Square Gardens when they opened for us, and the crowd booed them and gave them a really hard time. And they also hated Alex Harvey, who toured with us in America. And have you ever seen 10,000 people rise to their feet as one and boo somebody, you know, really badly and nastily? Then you do sense this collective consciousness. But it was poor old Alex who just got them really riled up, you know, by, I don't know what he did to upset them. Well, it came to a head where he used the C word at them. You're a loader. So yeah, that didn't help.
Nightfall, creating a world of contradiction, of paradoxes in life. The tourist is lured by a sense of adventure in losing himself in a modern Casbah, while the resident prefers an evening spent at a theater off-Broadway, where the actors and audience share their common experiences after each performance.
It's quite possible that I try to deal with audiences through film because it means I don't have to face them in the flesh, and I can't tell whether they have beards or not.
My goodness, just imagine 10 million people listening at one time. What a colossal invention in miniature.
So one way to avoid having trouble with your audience is to position yourself out of their reach. Broadcast television offers to do this, while widening your audience at the same time. But television can be manipulated as easily as any other medium. In August 1968, a series of confrontations between long-haired Vietnam protesters and police at the Democratic National Convention caused television stations to turn away from their live coverage of President Johnson inside the convention. Suddenly, the national spotlight was on the anti-war movement, and the political authority was not happy about it. Charges of conspiracy to incite violence were brought against 7 of the protest organizers, who included 2 of the founding Yippies, Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. After their acquittal, they found themselves on national television again, on one of the few programs with enough political clout, and enough of an iconic host to allow guests to voice opposition to the war.
The network panicked when I had the Chicago 7 on at the height of Vietnam and all that stuff, of course. And almost didn't air the show. But Jerry Rubin said, Cavett, you've got to use your medium to do politics. Politics is the most important thing you can do with your life or something. And I said, politics bores my ass off. And then Mr. Nixon, in his favorite way of doing things illegally, used the IRS to audit my staff and me. In the Nixon tapes, there's my name in the dialogue.
What the hell is Cavett? Oh, Chris, he's terrible. He's impossible. He loads every program. We've complained bitterly about the Cavett show.
But the best line of all is right at the end. It's only a few minutes. And it's a strange feeling to have the most powerful man in the world saying about you.
Well, is there any way we could screw it? That's what I mean. There must be ways. We've been trying to.
Is there a sense of power for you walking out in front of the cameras each night knowing that millions of people would be seeing you and hearing your voice?
Well, you can't think about that very much when you're doing it. You'd come apart if you sat there thinking. Actually, I did once, the sort of thing you were saying, a guest was going on boringly and I felt my eyes glazing over. And I fastened on the thought of, at this moment, I must be being seen in a bar in Cody, Wyoming, by a murderer in a cell in Florida, some old maid school teachers, as they used to be called, maybe Greta Garbo, as her said, she was alive at the time. You'd have to be to ever sit on and be watching me, I guess. And now we're connected by an electronic band of some sort that's totally artificial.
I made a big discovery about how to overcome self-consciousness.
The whole idea of being connected through an electronic band or through the music or through the massive sweaty bodies in a mosh pit. We're all chasing this feeling of being together, close to other people we have something in common with.
I still feel a little self-conscious at times. But by concentrating on others, by doing my best to make the whole situation easier, I overcome my own self-consciousness.
Intimacy, contact. And that's why Neil Diamond went out so often in the round, because he was closer to everybody. Now it's all internet driven, and the smartest of all acts almost know their audience by name.
It is a great pleasure to know that there's sort of instant feedback waiting for us, you know, that we have an audience of engaged listeners who will always tell us their opinions about whatever our latest work is.
It's global. It's one world now with the internet and everybody being able to connect in different ways than ever before. It's the same with music.
It's great to know that there is a group of people out there and an audience that is as interested as we are in locating and showcasing those unintentional singing talents that are out there in the world that otherwise wouldn't have a voice.
Even in the business sense now, people like Seth Godin and these kind of people that talk about you want to be successful, find your tribe, find the people and the crowd that loves what you do, and just keep marketing to them, just keep going to them, give them plenty of water to drink, and they'll be grateful and they'll keep coming back.
So there is a connection there. There's a real kind of a bond between an audience that you've never met, will never see.
Mm-hmm. Best, though, and this would be a solid advice to you, young man, don't let anything remotely resembling that cross your mind while you're doing a show.
Now I guess all I have to do is figure out how to create a sense of intimacy with an arena full of people.
There is a growing audience that is more thoughtful, more interested, more willing to have a dialogue that's uncomfortable, angry, and wants to see somebody else put it out there that they can get behind and cheerlead. So I think you can get into the consciousness now by either conscious marketing and manipulating and sort of like looking at what's popular and becoming the biggest fish in that school that's already turned, or, you know, you just put it out there and hope that those people who like that other person that you've connected with online comes over to discover who you're about, and it becomes much more about a community. Like I said, it becomes more about a community than a mass population. It becomes about communities of mindsets and thoughts and ideologies. So suddenly what you have now is demographics that are based on mindset, and that's beautiful.
All of those events of the 60s is the beginning of a global consciousness, which seems such a stupid thing to say nowadays. But it did happen then. We began to think of each other as a species on a planet. It was really different than before. With my generation, we grew up with people talking about heaven up there and hell down here and whatever, and you had maps and things. But when somebody actually went to outer space and took a photograph, you couldn't really argue about it. I mean, there it is. A globe floating in space with people living on it. You know, it changed the way we thought. Everybody since then, for your generation, you've grown up with that as a given. It's not something you... If somebody's arguing with you about that, they're clinically insane. It's a fact. And so that created a new spirit, you know. And everybody knows that, you know, we're not going to go anywhere else. So always in your mind is like, we're trapped here. You know. I mean, the other mentality was, we can go over there and kill all those fuckers and we can take over. But that mentality doesn't make much sense anymore because we're all trapped here on the planet with oxygen. We're needing oxygen. So slowly it's changing, you know. It makes everything else look ridiculous.
So why are we here? I don't mean that in the philosophical sense, although it would be nice to know. And after hearing about so much history, I find myself questioning what time I'm living in more than ever before. And wondering what kind of history we're all going to witness together in the future. Events we'll experience in a crowd or on TV, or in some amazing new way. But why am I on my way to speak to a stadium full of angry people? Well, my teaching colleagues are on strike in opposition to education cuts by the state government. I didn't know it at the time, but it was going to go down as the largest industrial action in Victorian history. And I saw a chance to stick it to the man.
Aidan is, as I said, an AU member, and he is going to explain some work that he's currently doing.
For me, this is what the end of the world looks like.
Thank you, Meredith.
Sorry, Aidan.
Can I get an assurance from you that there will be
Yeah, we've had a point of order raised for me to assure the meeting that there will be time for debate. Aidan will be brief. He simply wants to take some crowd shots. It's while the media are currently leaving, and then we will get on with the debate. Thank you. Aidan.
Thank you so much. So I teach media and music at South Oakley Secondary College. So the way I combine those two teaching methods is that in my spare time I make documentaries. What we would like to do is basically make a bit of a documentary right now, feature the AEU. Alright, we're being quick, we're being very, very quick.
They hate me. Is it my hair? Have I not grown enough of a beard? I'm trying to tell them how much we have in common, but they're not listening.
We just need some sound. Alright, thank you.
Please let Aidan get through this. The yelling out actually prolongs it.
How am I ever going to recover from this? There seems to be some very powerful groupthink going on here, and not the kind I was hoping for. I'm down to my last resort, the Nazi method. It's time to focus on a common enemy.
Alrighty. So, the first sound effect that we need is I would like you all to react the way that you would if Premier Ted Bellew came up on stage and said he will accept all of our demands effective immediately. What are you going to do?
Okay, so here's a bunch of people all sitting around looking bored and skeptical, when suddenly all of their hassles and troubles in life are pinned on one specific individual. And bingo.
What would you do if Premier Ted Bellew came on stage and said, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to implement performance pay? What would you say then? Okay, could you do me a favour and just pretend that I just
That could not have been better.
That was scary. People shouting out.
I love those people yelling out. Because they are like, they're the ones that get the collective consciousness going. So it's like, if somebody yells and then there's like someone else, and I'm like, what do I do? I've never been heckled before. I make documentaries. But we got them on side. I think we really made that work.
Are you shaking?
Oh yeah.
Maybe my nerves
Just
are going for you.
a little bit. That was cool. That was some of the best fun I've ever had, probably.